Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Booklore podcast, where we explore the power of literature and celebrate diverse voices in North Carolina by spotlighting local writers. I suggest you cozy up, grab a matcha or any drink of your choice, and tune in. I'll be your host, Christina. Today, we have the privilege of inviting Nina, oh my gosh, sorry,
It's okay.
onto this episode. Nita is a North Carolina-based award-winning author of queer stories for young adults, including the contemporary novel Who I Was With Her, World War II historical fiction novel Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken, short story Translating for the Machine, found in the Out There anthology, and that last but not least, the upcoming 2024 thriller Have You Seen This Girl? Their work as a literary translator has appeared on Autostraddle and in World Literature Today, and has also taken them to Austria on the Fulbright Teaching Fellowship. Additionally, Nita is a graduate of both UNC Greensboro and Guilford College. Go Spartans and Quakers. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nita.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to dive right in. So, our first question is really please introduce yourself in your own words. That can be your current work, hobbies, pets, literally anything goes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction, by the way. That was great.
No problem.
So my name so my name's Nita. Like Christina said, I am a YA author. I do live in North Carolina. I live in Chapel Hill, with my which I think you're also based out of, with my partner and our cat. I did close the door, so unfortunately the cat will not be joining us tonight. Um, in terms of hobbies, I was going to say writing, but that's my career, so not really a hobby anymore. I really enjoy swimming. I really enjoy playing Dungeons and Dragons, and currently also playing video games, which mostly means playing a lot of Baldur's Gate. So just can't escape the Dungeons and Dragons hobby, pretty much.
Okay, awesome. So our first, well, that was our first question. Apologies. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
But would you be able to tell us about your background and relationship with reading and writing growing up? So essentially your journey towards becoming a published writer today, and that can also include like what people, authors, and fellow books have inspired you.
Ooh, okay. It's a tough one. So I kind of always knew that I wanted to be a writer. I started writing when I was a kid. I was just writing like fan fiction and stuff. I think like most middle schoolers tended to do. And then in high school, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I tried to get published. I tried to find an agent. It just didn't work out for the time. I think part of it was just a lot of inexperience as well. I went to UNCG. I had a completely different major. And then in the spring of my freshman year, switched majors to English and was like, oh, right, I love writing. I should keep giving that a go. I got my first agent in 2015. We went out in submission with a couple books that didn't sell. And then I ended up switching agents in 2018. So I've been with the same agent now since 2018. His name's Eric Smith. He is also a young adult author. He's incredible. Highly recommend him. And then we sold Who I Was With Her in 2019, and it came out in 2020, smack in the middle of a pandemic. And then Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken followed in 2022, and now Have You Seen This Girl in 2024. So throughout all of that was like meeting a lot of writer friends through Twitter. I was on YA Twitter in like 2014 and 2015, which I think I deserve a medal for because YA Twitter during that time period was very entertaining.
One way to put it.
That's a very that's the nicest way I can put it, probably. But yeah, so I did that, and then I think in terms of like actual inspiration and stuff, the book that really inspired me when I was in middle and high school was Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, which was one of the first YA books that I ever read that I was like, oh, I want to do this. I want to write something like this. I think the way that Laurie in particular plays with language and the way that she writes is just so fascinating to me. Like, even when did Speak come out? Oh, 99, it is 25 years. Oh man, it's 25 years. Wow.
Did not
24
realize
years.
that either.
Oh, don't like that. But even it's still it's still relevant. I think her language is still just as fresh, and still like I still love taking it out and studying it whenever I'm kind of stuck now, to just revisit that, because I think she's just an immensely talented author and also a very wonderful person.
Okay, awesome. I actually love that book as well, so that's so wonderful to hear. But so next we're going to talk about Who I Was with Her, which was your debut, a YA contemporary novel exploring themes of grief and the complexities, fears, and pressures surrounding LGBTQ identities in youth, amongst other themes. It is set in North Carolina, and specifically follows the nonlinear storyline of a bisexual teenage girl's journey after the death of her secret girlfriend. So could you take us through your initial sparks of inspiration for this story and also how you found your story structure and writing process for it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the initial spark of this, I first got the idea for this story in 2015, and all of my stories, usually the way I begin, or at least the way I begin my YA, I can't say this is the way I begin all my work anymore, but the way I begin my YA is I always hear that first line. And so that first line of Who I Was with Her, the when I hear that she's dead, I run, that's not changed from the first draft in 2015. And I kind of, I'm a very like auditory person. So I kind of heard that in my head and I was like, okay, what's this about? Who are these characters? What's kind of happening here? And then from there, began writing the story that would eventually become Who I Was with Her. It had a lot of different titles before I settled on Who I Was with Her. All the character names were different. I think at one point Maggie's name was Katie, and then I became friends with Catherine Locke, and Katie was like, please don't, please change this character's name. Um, so I changed it to my childhood best friend's name. She was fine with it for the record, so and she's very much alive. But I wanted to explore what that particular grief would look like, and especially what that particular grief would look like if you were closeted. Because for me, I couldn't imagine losing a partner, losing a loved one, and not being able to tell anyone about it. Like, I'm already afraid of that in general. And the fact that Corinne has to go through all of that alone and has to grieve all of that by herself was something that I thought was really interesting to kind of unravel. Like, okay, what would that look like? How would that look for a teenage girl with like who thinks she has no one to lean on? Whether or not that is actually true is kind of what she finds out through the book.
Mm-hmm.
As far as process goes with it being nonlinear, I actually wrote it the way that it is in the book. So I wrote it out of order chronologically. Um, because for me, that was the best way to get the sort of sense of the emotional pacing. That was kind of how, when I was drafting it, that revealed itself to me, was like initially in that first draft, getting these snippets of flashback, getting these snippets of, okay, what was their relationship like? When I started editing it, and then when I went through it with my editor, I did like in two separate documents, put it in chronological order just so I could check for timeline flow, for accuracy, for those same like more linear emotional beats before they got kind of chunked back up and put back in the narrative in a non-chronological way. Shout out to who my copy editor on that book, because all the chapter headings being like 20 days gone, 30 days gone, someone did actually have to go behind me and count and make sure that all those days were correct. And I don't think they were initially. I tried really hard, and then it just ended up being a lot to keep track of. Real quick, let me grab my, I just have to lean down and grab my charger because my
Yeah,
computer is.
of course, no problem.
Great, and we're good.
So, I mean, that was super cool to hear about, and definitely a lot to learn from for anyone else interested in tackling that type of timeline. So, could you expand on why you ventured into young adult literature and also the importance of diversity and LGBTQ representation in this genre, especially given all the mainstream discourse over like early education and school libraries, especially in southern states like North Carolina?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So for me, I think writing YA was something that I always wanted to do, because for me, those were the stories that I really gravitated to and really found the most important, where you could kind of make the most impact. I think, especially because when I started writing queer YA, even in like 2014, 2015, we were just like the We Need Diverse Books movement had just started. We were just starting to get more queer books. Like when I was growing up, there was Julie Ann Peters, David Levithan and Melinda Lowe, and Alex Sanchez, and those were kind of the main books that we had. And they are all fantastic authors, and they were all great authors. But I really, really loved like sad contemporary books. Like I think my favorite book as a teen was If I Stay by Gail Forman, which which probably undoubtedly influenced a fair amount of who I was with her, even subconsciously. And I really wanted to write that kind of like sad queer narrative that I had loved as a teenager, but making it gay, making that representation there because that was representation for me and that was important. And because I at the time didn't see a lot of books that were set. I saw a lot of books set in North Carolina because I read a lot of Sarah Dessen, but
Of course.
of course, but there's not there weren't a lot of queer books set here, and I think too that kind of prevalent attitude of oh well, queer people either like don't exist in the South, or if you're in the South and you're queer, you must want to leave. And I really wanted to write, at least through like Maggie's character, I wanted to show a character who like was queer, was from North Carolina, and like didn't necessarily have that drive to like not be in North Carolina because queer people
Mhm,
live here too. And we live in, areas that aren't just like Chapel Hill or Durham or Greensboro, or areas that tend to be more accepting and more
mhm.
tolerant. Like I wanted to show that kind of like, yeah, there I was a queer kid in very small town North Carolina. Like we do exist. I think for me it's important showing that different type of experience. And then for Corinne in particular, showing a different class level of experience as well, of like, oh, well, I don't know if I'm going to go to college or if I can afford to go to college, if that's even something I want to do. I think having to decide all of that at 18 is a ridiculous amount of pressure. I would would not go through that again. I'll just make characters go through it. So I wanted to kind of show that aspect of it as well. As far as I think a lot of the recent discourse, controversy, what have you, that we've kind of seen around these narratives being allowed in schools and these narratives being allowed in general, which frustrates me to no end, is that kind of like, well, if you ban this, kids are gonna find it anyway. And I think making it less accessible, one, I think sends a horrible message of like, okay, you're banning books by BIPOC authors, you're banning books by queer authors, you're banning books by marginalized identities. You are, whether intended or not, sending a message that like, oh no, these are adult themes. These are not things that you as a teenager can think about or have feelings about, which is, or like, which is just absolutely not true. And frankly is kind of ridiculous, I think. So I think it's important to continue to have those narratives and continue to have them be accessible in in libraries, in bookstores, in a way that like teens can still get access to them, because at the end of the day that is still who our audience is for YA authors. Like
Mhm.
I know a lot of the YA market now does tend to get driven by like adult tastes, adult whatever, that if I never see the word spicy applied to a YA book again, it will be too soon. um, but it tends to get driven, especially because if you're looking at like market wise, adults have the purchasing power. And I'm like, that's great. That's not who our audience is. And I think it's very useful to remember that, at the end of the day, these are for teenagers, or they should be like, they should be about teenagers. They should be for teenagers. And teens should be able to have access to all of those stories and all of that like wide range of experiences.
Yeah, totally. All of what you said totally resonates with me, and I'm sure with everyone as well, especially here in the state, considering our state legislature and leaders. This
Hmm,
is directed towards you guys. So
fun.
we're gonna move into your second novel, which is Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken. And this
Mhm.
marked a switch in genre to historical fiction, this
Yeah.
time diving into the swing youth resistance movement in Nazi Germany and LGBTQ experiences in the 30s and 40s.
Mhm.
Were there any difficulties you found with handling this new genre and preparation for it as sort of your follow up? And how was it developing this new ensemble characters?
Ooh, these are such great questions. Um, Definitely, it's so funny because I think the amount of research, I mean, there was obviously more research going into a historical, but it's also I didn't quite feel like it was because I had to do about the same amount of research for who I was with her as someone who did no sports in high school whatsoever. I had to look up all of the process of like, okay, what's applying for colleges like with a sports scholarship? What is cross country running like? I don't like running myself. So like, how do I dig into that? And in some ways, having to dig into that research wasn't so different in the context of a historical. I think the hardest part for doing a historical was actually the smaller picture stuff. Like I could find plenty of info about Nazi Germany, about the Holocaust, about resistance in Berlin during that time. But I think what ended up being difficult was like, okay, well, what fabrics were available and what would they wear? What sort of would an everyday meal look like? How much would a ride on the subway cost between these two districts of Berlin in this time period? So having to do all of that everyday life sort of research tended was what was a little more difficult. I will say that's where primary sources ended up being very helpful to me, particularly having a degree in German, being able to actually read those primary sources. I don't know if I would have been able personally for me to do that if I just had to like rely on Google Translate, especially because it got to the point where I'm like on the German Federal Archives website because they have their own picture library and they have their own entire section of just like all these pictures of everyday life and having to like search things in their very nice archival library and find all of that information. So, but I really enjoyed the switch. I was very pleasantly surprised when my publisher agreed to let me switch and then agreed to let me switch again. With have you seen this girl? I'm very lucky that they keep letting me just hop genres to kind of whatever I please. It was fun getting to write more of like an ensemble cast for
Mhm,
this for the four girls. For that, I was really inspired actually by like the movies that I really loved growing up that do the kind of ensemble cast thing. So I was thinking of like Stand By Me or The Goonies, or there was actually a Swing Kids movie that my dad showed me. It was very good.
mhm.
It's Christian Bale in it, which is
Ooh.
wild to see him playing a German teenager. But stuff like that, where you had this core group of kids and they kind of all sort of fall into these dynamics with each other. Even stuff, honestly, since the trailer for it just came today, like Avatar The Last Airbender, where you've got that, like, everyone's got their own distinct thing, their own distinct personality. I really did want to. It was fun to get to play with that. It was fun to get to play with it from Charlie's perspective as well, being the kind of like second in command here rather than because I think a lot of some of those movies tend to go like, okay, this is the perspective of like the kid who is in charge and the kid who is the leader of this small group. And I wanted to go with, okay, well, what would it be like if that wasn't this character? Because it made her arc a lot clearer as a character. It'd be like having her figuring out like who she is and what she wants in the world. Whereas for a character like Gelly, for example, where she kind of already thinks she knows who she is. Granted, she does have an arc and it ends up being very tragic, sadly. But getting to explore more of like Charlie's changing world point or worldview was something that I found really interesting.
Oh, it's so cool to hear. And I guess you did mention your degree in German, but our next question is, have you found any direct or indirect intersection or balance between your work as an author and a translator? And I guess how has your experience in translation, German, ASL woven in conjunction with your daily life and writing goals?
Ooh. Okay, I don't, sadly, I don't do as much in ASL anymore as when I lived in Greensboro, just because the deaf community in Greensboro is much larger than the one here. Also, I've now switched to writing full time, which means I
Mhm,
don't interact as much with people anymore. I used to work at the Apple store. I meet a ton of people at the Apple store, and especially in Greensboro, we had a fair amount of deaf customers, so I got to use that on a daily basis. The German I use surprisingly regularly, but only because it's easier to keep up with as a translator. If I like want to read a book in German, then that's a way I can just like there's a great online library from the Goethe Institute where you can just check out German books like you would through Libby. Um, so I'll just read that for fun or just keep trying to stay immersed in the sort of language learning. I think I'll talk to friends who live in Austria and will like speak German so I can kind of stay in with that. The merging, I think of like translating and writing, it's kind of and balancing that with the degrees. It's kind of difficult. I feel like a lot more these days it tends towards writing just because as a translator, you are your own advocate. You're essentially your own agent, which I don't always have the time or energy to do or research. So, like, for example, if I have a book I want to translate, it is on me as the translator to find out who the publisher is of the book in the original language, contact the publisher, be like, hey, are the English rights for this available? And if they are, usually they want you to do about a 20 to 25 page summary yourself. And then with that summary, being like, okay, well, the rights are available. What publishers can I pitch this book to who would want to buy this book in English? It actually really is a lot like being my own agent. So, and a lot of the time it's just like, especially because for translation, you don't want necessarily to spend the hours and hours it would take translating a full book without the guarantee of a contract for it. So I'll tend to do those 20 to 25 pages, but doing more is almost kind of a like, you do want to wait until you have a contract because you don't want to do all of that work and either not have it pan out or end up doing it for free or whatnot. But I think it's been interesting trying to find the balance of everything now. And I think it kind of there end up being ebbs and flows. There are some days I do more things with German or more things with translation. There's some days I'll do more things with writing. I need to get back into doing more things with ASL. Even it's funny, even now I started picking up my other minor was theater. So I started picking up more theater things and getting involved with like local theater in Chapel Hill too, just to be able to like have a creative hobby that was not sitting in front of a computer screen. As much as I love playing video games, I'm like, there's only so many times where I can like spend 4 hours straight working on a book and then be like, and now I'm going to go spend 4 more hours staring at a computer. So I think just doing that, I think just trying to find a way to keep everything balanced and keep everything in check, which is not always the easiest thing to do. But
yeah, that's a great perspective to hear. And I know we have a great theater scene here in Chapel Hill, so it should be super cool. But I guess a little follow-up to the topic of translation is it may seem obvious to many, but how would you personally define the power of translation in the literary landscape in particular?
oh, that's such a okay two-part question. Because on one hand, I think translated literature is so important. I think being able to have those perspectives and perspectives that an American audience or a Western audience particularly would not necessarily think to seek out or think to read, I think is very, very, I'm really grateful that we have it. I think translators should be paid more. There's a discussion going along like kind of right now as well in translation of like naming the translator per se, because oftentimes if you read a translated book, it doesn't say it was translated on the cover. Depends on who publishes it. And I think trying to get more of that recognition has been very important. At the same time, it's also been something that to think about, something that we like look at kind of in that community as well of okay, who gets to translate, who gets to be the person essentially controlling this narrative, deciding this narrative, deciding what books get translated, what books get published, even like looking at the identity of the translator, for example, like you'll have which admittedly for me and German doesn't really is not something that comes into play a lot, but if you get like white authors translating like Chinese literature or any other sort of like languages that are not considered like the bigger languages, so like not German or French or Spanish, if you start looking at either like endangered languages or languages that have a much smaller audience, those often also get a lot less support too than probably your big five, which would be or big four, so German, Spanish, Italian, French are probably going to be the main four you're going to see a lot of literature from. And it's just very interesting looking at like the gatekeepers in publishing in particular and thinking, okay, who are we publishing? What perspectives are we encouraging? What perspectives in translating are we encouraging? And who are we either allowing to translate or like lifting up who is translating these? And it's just it's a very complicated issue, but it's just always like fascinating to look at, I think. But I think definitely like having literature that's translated is super important. And I definitely think being able to name the translators, being able to kind of like give that sort of spotlight to a profession that is slowly getting more and more like spotlight, I think, as the years go by. I think there's a lot more conversations happening now about translated literature. But keeping that sort of perspective, I think, is important. Like there's books that I read as a kid that are technically translated that I did not know were translated. Like Inkheart was actually originally a German book, which I didn't realize until I went to Germany. I was like, why? Oh, there's a lot of German copies of Inkheart. Interesting. I'm like, oh, right, this is what it was originally written in. I think from the opposite end of that too, looking at from the American market, what gets translated and sold in other countries. So because it varies really wildly and it really depends on like publisher support and marketing and stuff. You'll see like because it's kind of a given at this point, like you have books from really big authors and like when they sell immediately it's like sold in like 26 different countries and like 26 different translations happening. And then you'll have books that like just never get translated or never get that sort of thing, and it's not something authors have a ton of control over, unfortunately. It's like my German friends will be like, when are your books coming out in German? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm so sorry guys. Like so it's just very interesting to look at like, okay, what like especially because I think a lot of bookstores tend to be dominated by American literature that's translated into the other countries' respective languages as well, which is also just very fascinating to me because the amount of literature coming out of the United States that gets translated is not the same as the amount coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything you said is so cool. Like this conversation is so important. I feel like translation is really just another like nuance that talks like sort of reflects the power, fear, and like dominance that language can have globally. So it's fascinating to really talk about. So we're going to actually close out on some of our last general questions, which is so crazy. Time has passed by so fast. But is there a common goal or theme amongst all your works that you hope readers and listeners take away from the most, if you can even, encapsulate that?
I do enjoy making my readers cry. I don't think that's the goal, but it's nice when it happens. I think it's weird because writing a thriller made that kind of feel different. And then I would say, like, if you'd asked me this before the thriller and it was just like Nothing Sung and Who I Was with Her, I think the answer would have been like, oh, I really do want to show like that queer experience, and especially like across time, across continents, in different areas. And then with Have You Seen This Girl, because there is still a lot of queerness in it. Sid is non-binary. It's my first non-binary protagonist as a non-binary author, so that's fun. There is still a lot of thoughts about like gender and stuff in it, but because it's a thriller, also it is a lot more plot based than my other books. So that was also something I had to balance. But I think if there's anything I do want audiences to take away from my books, it's just that there are a myriad of queer experiences, and the things that I'm writing are only like a very, very, very small slice of those queer experiences, but also hopefully, even if like Corinne's experience is not exactly your experience, or with like Charlie, because it's set in a historical setting, that the emotions still ring true and that there's still something to identify with and something that still resonates with an audience, even if the experiences of the characters are like completely wildly different. I kind of hope that there's still something for people to take away with each of them, whether it's like hope or determination or other. I'm not quite sure what the thriller one would be yet, but other things like that.
Awesome. And
oh, my computer announces the time. I'm so sorry.
No, you are totally good. To follow up that one, do you have any advice for like young readers and writers, especially LGBTQ? Oh my gosh,
it's okay. It's a long acronym.
Youth.
Yes, read as much as possible. Truly read as much as possible. Read as wide of an array of things as you can get your hands on. Read, I would say, as someone who does still read a lot of fan fiction and read a lot of fan fiction in high school, that's also fine. I think also taking the time to like read published novels as well too, because you're gonna see, not that I read really truly some amazing fan fiction, but there is also a difference in between like reading a fan fiction and reading something that's gone through the hands and edits of several people, which I think is very useful. Read stuff you don't like and then think about, okay, why don't I like this? What about this is not resonating with me? That's not to say read things that are like harmful to you, right? But like if you read, okay, I hate Heart of Darkness. I hate that book so much. I had to read it in high school and I hated it. I had to read it in college and I hated it. I did never fully finish it both times. But being able to point at it and be like, okay, but I know why I don't like this. I know what about this doesn't resonate with me is a really important skill. And I think kind of can go a long way towards your own writing and your own reading habits and just having that better like knowledge of yourself of like, okay, well, I know I don't like this, so I'm not going to do it. Or, well, I don't like this. Why do I not like it? And then kind of being able to interrogate that, being able to kind of break it down and be like, okay, well, I don't like this aspect of it, but I like this. So maybe I'll try to incorporate this in the same way that like artists do a lot of like little sketches and studies over and over to get better. I think with writing, really, truly, the more you read, the more you write, you do get better at it. Even if like sometimes like what I would do as a and sometimes I'll still do like even as a high schooler in particulars, I would read something I really liked and then like the next 2 weeks when I wrote, I would try to imitate it. And I think that actually can be really, really helpful because it helps you really get into that other mindset and that other person's style and really like breaking down and understanding why it works in a way that's not quite as technical as being in an English class and like having to, quite literally analyze every single bit of the text. But yeah, that's really the main thing that's helped me. And that always helps me even like now as a full-time writer, if I'm stuck, if I don't feel like working on something or if something feels like it's not just working, I will go back and reread things I enjoy or reread authors that I find inspiring just to be like, okay, this works. And if it's not quite the tone of what I'm going for in this book, usually that something about it will spark something or break me out of that kind of creative slump. So
Great. That was actually our last sort of big question, but I'm actually starting something a little new where I try to have our last question be a fun little like mini book talk to sort of ask questions. So we're gonna finish with what are your top 3 book tropes or just literary trends?
okay. I know it's the cliche answer, and I don't care. I love me and enemies to lovers. I love when it's done well. If it's done well, I'm a like that's some catnip for me, and I'm like, oh, these people hate each other, but there's something there. Like that I enjoy. And it's like that spark of something there has to be there. Because if they truly just hate each other, I'm like, whatever. But I love that one. I'm always bad at coming up with tropes other than enemies to lovers is my favorite one.
No pressure. Like if you want to talk about that one, like
Top
okay.
three. I think I like I don't mind the family trope when it feels earned. I don't like when it's just like, oh, we're going to say this is a found family trope, and then it starts replicating like heteronormative family structures. I'm like, no, if you give me a group of weirdos who end up really liking each other, that's it. That works for me. I don't care if they don't fall into like a what you would consider a family structure. Like, yes, these are found family now. Um, I really like my main two. I'm trying to think. I like a slow burn. I don't even know if that's I love a slow burn. I love it's a really again, there's a really fine line with that one too of like there's a certain point where I'm like, we gotta start leaning out of the slow and into the burn. But I really like things where like that payoff feels really earned. Again, I'm a huge X-Files fan, and speaking of slow burns, you've got like they don't even kiss until season 5. And it's insane. It like drives me up the wall every time I watch it because I'm just like, please get these two together. And then they eventually do, or if like even in books too, if it's like you got like a 500 or so page door stopper and they're not even really showing like super interested in each other until 250, catnip. Love that stuff.
Oh my gosh, yeah, totally relatable with that last number. Oh my gosh. But okay, so that actually brings our time to an end. So our sort of my last request for you is to please feel free to use this remaining time to shout out anything from your socials, upcoming news, new thriller book, and like advocacy, everything. Like, feel free.
Yeah, so I am at Nita Tyndall right now on Instagram and on Twitter for however long Twitter remains a viable website. I wouldn't follow me there. I don't post there very often. Instagram's usually the best place to find me. Have You Seen This Girl comes out next summer. I believe it comes out next May. I don't remember exactly what date. It comes out next May, 2024. It is a thriller. It's my first YA thriller. It is about a non-binary teen named Sid who it's set back in North Carolina. I came back to North Carolina for this book. But it's set in a small town where girls start going missing, and it's the same MO as Sid's dad, who is a serial killer, had 10 years before. So Sid starts wondering if someone's targeting them. They start getting drawn into the mystery of who's killing these girls, why is someone killing these girls, is it actually a targeted message to them? And then they also start falling for this new girl who's moved to town because she's the only person who doesn't know Sid for what their father's done. And so it's also I'm not trying to promise it's super romancy, it's really not compared to my other books, but like it does have a little bit of slow burn because it's a little bit of that, like, okay, a little bit of the ticking clock to, okay, how long is it going to be before this girl finds out too, and before she reacts. So I'm very excited for that one. I think the cover, we just revealed the cover for that one a couple weeks ago, and I think Toma Wagner, who was the artist, was absolutely brilliant on that. It's probably my favorite cover to date, and I like all of my covers. Yeah, I trying to think of other things I can shout out other than like give to the Chapel Hill Friends of the Library.
Oh yeah.
any sort of Equality North Carolina could always use a shout and could always use more money and more support. So
Okay, awesome. Yes, support your public libraries.
yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much for spending this evening. It's evening time for us here, but to everyone listening, thank you so much. Thank you, Nita. Just I hope you all have had a wonderful time. I know I have. So I will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.